Hank, your chosen solution is exactly equally as arbitrary as all of the other options that you dismissed and many that you didn't think of. So apparently Hank Green made a video about fish, and then I made a video about basically exactly the same topic without knowing about his video, and even though we both know the same relevant science, we very much do not come to the same conclusions. So what happened? Hank, I'm a big fan, and like you said, I don't think anyone in this discussion is actually mad. It's all in good faith because this is super interesting, and we're a bunch of nerds. So with that being said, I do think you're making some mistakes, and I want to talk about them.
So this is going to start out kind of philosophical with the fact that words have meanings, all of them, and those meanings mean something in our heads, and this is fine. That is where meaning begins, but it is not where meaning always ends.
So right away, I disagree. Humans make meaning, organize that meaning with language, and then impose the structure of that language onto reality. But okay, that's just a teaser. We'll come back to that kind of stuff later. Let's start by actually talking about fish. Hank starts by showing lots of things that are potentially fish.
This is a fish, and this is a fish. This is definitely a fish. Why is a bass to me like the most fish-like fish? I don't know. But is this a fish? I mean, yeah, it's not really fish-shaped. What about this? That's a horse, but is also a fish?
No, it is not. There are lots of things that you can say horses are, which might be surprising and fascinating. They're osteichthyans, for example. They're also sarcopterygians, but neither of those things necessitate that they are fish. That's also just a little taste of where I'm going, but we can be more specific and clear, so here we go.
But interestingly, this used to be a fish.
No, it did not, but it did used to be a baby whale, and before that, a whale embryo, etc., etc., and I know Hank knows this, but this is just one of my pet peeves. I really think that science communicators need to do a better job about being explicitly clear and accurate when they're talking about evolution in general, because this is where misunderstandings come from. What is true is that if you traced the whale family tree back in time long enough, like hundreds of millions of years back, eventually you would find whale ancestors that we'd call fish. And that's wild. Anyway, this is not even close to Hank's main topic, so I apologize for the tangent, but I do think there is an important difference between this used to be a fish and this animal's ancestors a long time ago used to be fish. And I know some of you are already going to go, well, hold on, Milo, if the thing's ancestors used to be a fish and you cannot evolve out of a clade, then definitionally the thing is a fish. And no, hold on, I'll get there.
There's a fight going on, and I'm in it. I'm in the fight, and I want to be in the fight. I like it here.
Yes, and I'm glad you're here too, and I'm happy to be in it as well. Welcome to, kind of, the philosophy of biology.
And also it leads me to believe that maybe sharks aren't fish, or whales are.
Again, no, sharks are fish, whales are not fish. So there it is, there's the main point of disagreement. Now let's get into where it's coming from.
What people think of as a fish has changed over time as our language has gotten more specific.
Yes, totally, and that is a very good thing.
But before dictionaries, like the thing you think of when I say fish is mostly what we were going with. That was most of human history.
Yes, and I think that that's still what we're going with, and I think that that is more or less how we should continue to understand what counts as a fish. So, okay, now we're getting somewhere, so keep going.
And what definitions today mostly do with fish is that they try to describe what you think of when you think of a fish.
Yes, and that is a good idea. Hank then goes through a number of dictionaries' definitions for fish, and they all do at least fine. But crucially, he points out that none of them perfectly encapsulate all of the things that we think of as fish, while excluding all of the things that we think are not fish.
What all of these things are is an attempt to create a line that you can draw around all fish that excludes all things that aren't fish. Some of them do better jobs than others, but wildly, this is a very difficult thing to do.
Yes to all of that, and I'm going to take it one step further and say all language is like that. The universe is deeply complex and does not offer up to us objective, discrete things. We use language to draw lines around sets of matter and divvy it up so that we can understand, communicate, and think about our world. But Hank thinks that this way, which is how we've historically defined fish, is not how we can define groups of life.
This is not the case with life. And instead of a list, we could have a definition that told us something new because it brought the definition outside of our minds, outside of the vibes, outside of what we think of as a fish, and into the real world. Not in here, out there.
Okay, I totally understand where this is coming from because it really seems like you should be able to make this distinction. But you really actually can't. You cannot get a definition out of your head. There's an important sense in which we can definitely make them less based on vibes, but definitions of words are human inventions that live in human minds. It's not like there's some objective capital R real definition of any particular discrete thing that's written into the fabric of the universe for us to discover. I'm not even really sure what that could possibly mean or look like. I think Plato would love that idea. Like Hank says earlier in his video, some definitions are better and worse. So we can absolutely make definitions that are more specific, that are more consistent, that are less fluid, that are less based on vibes, but they're all still human inventions. And we pick the ones that are the most useful. And I also think that the more useful ways of grouping or defining things might change depending on the context. And now we're getting really close to this all making sense. And if all of this seems too abstract for you right now, I understand. Luckily for you, very soon Hank is going to try to give us a new, more concrete definition of fish. And I can use that to show you a related and very concrete mistake that he's making. But I want to spend some time on the more abstract stuff because Hank also does. So there's one more kind of abstract thing, and then we'll go back to talking about fish.
But a much better definition is when it actually describes something that exists in the real world. And the lineage of fish, starting with the first common ancestor, a vertebrate with fins and scales and blood and a two-chambered heart and a hard head, is a real thing that existed in the real world, and that is the common ancestor of all fish.
So this is only kind of true. All right, a couple of very quick science concepts that are going to be crucial moving forward. Evolutionary family trees like this are called cladograms, or I'll just call them phylogenetic trees. When you can make an imaginary snip on one place on a phylogenetic tree, such that the whole chunk you remove has a stem of one individual animal or species or whatever, and all of its descendants, that entire group that you've removed is called a monophyletic group. And that term is going to be very important. What Hank was getting at there is that if you imagined an entire big family tree of all animals, and you found all the places on that tree where there are things that we would call fish, and you traced all of those lineages back up the tree, eventually you'd find a single ancestor that all of those lineages have in common. And that would be a pretty straightforward place to start thinking about how you would go about making a real and clear definition of a fish. Except not really. And basically the reason comes down to just that biological change is slow. Imagine, as an analogy, you took a photo of yourself every single day of your life, and you could lay them all out and look at all of them in a row. There would not be one singular photo that you would point to and go, aha, this is where I was first an adult, and all the photos of me after are me as an adult, and all the photos of me before this, I was still a child. In the same way, if you could see every individual animal in all of humanity's long evolutionary history, all lined up, there's not a single individual that you would look at and point to and go, aha, this one is the first Homo sapien, and its kids are Homo sapiens, but its parents are not, and its mate is also not, or maybe it is. Actually, both of those have weird implications for this question. Do you see how this is complicated and there are no clear boundaries? In the case of fish, Hank's trying to switch us away from thinking about what counts as a fish as being things like having gills and scales and fins, to instead a common ancestor and all of its descendants. And that's more specific, it's more consistent, it's therefore probably better in some contexts, but we have to be careful not to fool ourselves into thinking that it is also therefore somehow more attached to reality. So as I hope to have shown, even when common ancestry and monophyly are our criteria for defining a group, their edges to the group are still fuzzy, even though we would desperately like for them to be hard, discrete, clear boundaries. So even in this case, with common ancestry and monophyly as our criteria, we're ultimately still going to end up eventually having to make an ultimately arbitrary decision about where those boundaries go. There will still not be a perfect way to encapsulate everything that is a fish and exclude everything that is not. I would speculate that a large part of the reason why it's harder to see that in this case with these criteria is because where that arbitrary line has to be drawn is between animals that lived hundreds of millions of years in the past. So the individual animals or even individual species or populations that would fall sort of on the fuzzy boundary line are pretty easy for us to conveniently ignore and pretend that they don't exist. Okay, so now Hank is going to kind of implicitly make an argument for the group of animals that he thinks should be counted as the fish. And it's an interesting argument, but I do think he makes multiple mistakes along the way, so let's go one implied premise at a time. The first thing is just a true, really interesting, cool biological fact, which is that all of the things that people think of as fish do not make up a monophyletic group.
The fish group includes 3 different groups: the bony fish like bass and marlin, the cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays, and the jawless fish like hagfish and lampreys.
So what we think of as being fish includes some agnathans, which are frequently called the jawless fish, plus the chondrichthyans, which are sharks and rays, plus some but not all of the osteichthyans, which are an enormous group of animals that includes all of the other fish and amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, the tetrapods, land vertebrates, basically, which of course we do not think of as being fish. So there is no way to make just one snip off of the family tree of life such that the chunk that you remove with an ancestor and all of its descendants contains all of the fish and nothing else. You can't do it. It's impossible, which means that fish are not a monophyletic group. It's pretty cool, right? It means, for example,
we are way more closely related to bass than bass are to sharks.
Okay, so far so good, but all of the next steps that Hank makes are, I think, where he gets lost.
If we want a definition of fish that is about reality rather than vibes, that pulls the definition outside of us and into the actual biological reality of life on Earth, you can absolutely do that. We could create a group that includes all of the fish, including the tetrapods. The problem is, we already have a name for that group. It's the craniate.
Okay, there's kind of 2 related points here, and I think both are mistaken. The first is, again, this mission to pull a definition of a word out of our heads and to ground it instead and solely in reality. And I hope I've already explained mostly well enough why I think that's a misguided endeavor. But in conjunction with that, there is a hidden assumption that equates reality with monophyly. The idea is that fish can only be a real group if they are a monophyletic one. But why? There's no reason given for that. All of the things that people think of when they think of fish are real, and all of the traits that they have mostly in common are real, and there are real reasons why it's nice to have a term that picks out this non-monophyletic group of organisms. So fish don't become more real category of things when we restrict it to a particular monophyletic lineage. It just becomes a monophyletic one instead of a polyphyletic one. That's all. But because Hank wants to ground the meaning of the word fish in reality, and he thinks that reality is achieved by monophyly, he's now going to go on a hunt looking for a monophyletic group of animals that he can say is what fish really are. And he starts with craniates, all the animals that have a skull. But he thinks that there's a problem with identifying craniates as fish.
We could create a group that includes all of the fish, including the tetrapods. The problem is, we already have a name for that group. It's the craniates. Any animal that has a skull is a fish or descended from a fish. There are no fish that are not descended from the first craniate ancestor all those hundreds of millions of years ago. But I actually don't like that as a classification because it's just too broad and we already have that. We've got craniates. But also hagfish that are craniates but not vertebrates are so different from all the other fish that I will happily call them not fish. Like the hagfish, maybe they're like cuttlefish and jellyfish, just something named fish, but not actually a fish. No one is making them be fish. They don't have to be fish.
The main point is that craniates are not a good candidate for the label fish because it's too broad and we already have a word for it, craniates. But there's also this interesting subpoint about hagfish, which is interesting because I think Hank's cladistics is just wrong. He says that hagfish are not vertebrates, and in fact the next candidate he's going to talk about is vertebrates, which he says doesn't include hagfish. But I think that's incorrect. I think hagfish are vertebrates. They just don't have a vertebral column. Which I know does sound not possible, but I think it's true. Look, this is a very specific case, and it's a more straightforwardly scientific one, so I'm a little bit outside of my particular area of expertise here. So if there are any fish or early vertebrate paleontologists or biologists out there, let me know if hagfish are still considered vertebrates, because they didn't used to be, but I think they are now. And that's because when you define the group Vertebrata as the common ancestor of all vertebrates and all of that common ancestor's descendants, hagfish are among those descendants. So the hagfish's ancestors had a backbone. It's just that their specific lineage at some point evolved to lose it. So they don't have it anymore. But because hagfish are still nested within the monophyletic clade of Vertebrata, they are still vertebrates, even though they don't have a vertebral column. Which is actually very similar to how Hank is going to eventually end up arguing that humans are fish, even though we don't really look like fish anymore. But there is an important distinction between these two cases that maybe is starting to become clear, but it's going to get even more clear. Anyway, so if craniates isn't the group that we can identify fish with, Hank thinks we should go one step more specific.
However, this doesn't actually solve our problems. If we cut the hagfish off and say, okay, fish is everything descended from the ancestor of all the other fish, we also have a name for that. That is a group that already exists as well. That's the vertebrates.
Okay, so for the same reason, we can't call vertebrates the fish because we already have a word for that group, vertebrates. So Hank decides we need to go one step more specific. And the next step is where I think Hank makes the most obvious mistake that he makes. So if you've been waiting for a more clear, concrete example of a mistake that I think he makes, here it comes. I'm just going to basically let him make the next few steps all at once together so you can see all of the final stages of the argument come together.
And so, if we want fish to actually be a thing, we have to go one step further. Perhaps the cartilaginous fish aren't fish either. Perhaps sharks and rays are just sharks and rays. And if we carve them off too, we would actually be left with a group that are fish and are not represented by anything else. This is the bony fish, the group that includes all of the fish descended from the first bony fish, which has pretty much everything you think of as a fish in it, except for the sharks and rays and hagfish and lampreys, but also does include the tetrapods. So this doesn't solve the second problem, which is that tetrapods would still be in the group. But here's the thing. I don't think this is a problem because I think I'm a fish.
Okay, interesting, right? Unfortunately, I think there are basically three related problems. First, Hank, you say that we cannot identify fish with the craniates because we already have a word for that, craniates. And you say that we cannot identify fish with the vertebrates because we already have a word for that, vertebrates. So you say that instead we are left with the group that includes bony fish and tetrapods. But we also already have a word for that. They're called the osteichthyans. They're the sister group to the chondrichthyans, which are the sharks and rays. Second related problem, why not go even one step more specific? Osteichthyes has two subgroups, the Actinopterygii, which are the ray-finned fish, and the Sarcopterygii, which is lobe-finned fish plus tetrapods. Why not just make fish associated with just the Actinopterygians? They make up the vast majority of what most people think of as fish anyway. Sure, it would be a little weird that coelacanths, a lobe-finned fish, would not count as fish, and that sharks would not count as fish. But at least, emus also don't count as fish. Third, even if we insist on staying at the taxonomic level of osteichthyes and chondrichthyes, why associate fish with the bony fish and tetrapods and not with the sharks and rays? You might say, look, whatever my definition of fish is, it has to include bass.
Why is a bass to me the most fish-like fish? I don't know.
And so I'd prefer that we make osteichthyes the true fish and exclude sharks and rays. But I could just as easily say, well, whatever my definition of fish is, it needs to exclude Stegosaurus. So I'd prefer that we exclude the bony fish and we make sharks and rays the true fish. My point is not to actively argue for a different one of these options. My point is just to say that, Hank, your chosen solution is exactly equally as arbitrary as all of the other options that you dismissed and many that you didn't think of. And as a follow-up, to insist that we must choose just one of these groups to identify as the real true fish is not necessarily a good idea. We do not have to do that. Now, Hank does make a really interesting point about the advantage of doing exactly that.
And this division, in which only bony fish are true fish, makes sense to me because it highlights how extremely different sharks and rays are from bony fish, which we don't think about. We can't hold it in our brains, but it's really true. And that's to say nothing of the hagfish, which are, just look at them. That's a fish?
Hey, you know what? Fair enough. That is a really cool observation that we rarely think about. but it's not one that we need to change the common understanding of the word fish in order to communicate. I could just as easily tell someone, hey, did you know that all of the things that you think of as a fish are not more closely related to each other than some of them are to other things which are not fish? Like, for example, within vertebrates, there are two big groups. One of them is cartilaginous fish, like sharks, and another one is made up of bony fish and all tetrapods, which means that a bass is more closely related to you than it is to a shark, like Hank mentions at one point. There, I did it. I can get across all the same concepts and could elaborate on them further without changing the meaning of the word fish. We can keep chondrichthyes to mean a specific thing, and we can keep osteichthyes to mean a different specific thing, and we can keep fish to mean yet another thing that overlaps with but is not identical to either of those things. Because, and here's another way to think about this, fish is just not a phylogenetic term. It's a colloquial term. That means all the things that you think of when you think of a fish, basically vertebrates that are not tetrapods. In other words, fish is just a different kind of term than vertebrates or chondrichthyes or sarcopterygians. And like I said in my last video,
and the fact that the categories that the taxonomist made and that the common person made overlap but are not the same is not a problem. It just means that you need to be clear about which one you're using.
Somebody in my TikTok comments wrote that whales are phylogenetically fish. And I read that and I went like, imagine if I said, I am economically a Homo sapiens. What? What does that mean? It doesn't make any sense because Homo sapiens is not an economic term. That's kind of what it sounds like to me when someone says whales or humans are phylogenetically a fish. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't make any sense because fish is not a phylogenetic term. It's just like a more broad, common colloquial term. Here's another example. Somebody in my YouTube comments asked if the same logic could be applied to dinosaurs and birds, because dinosaurs are a monophyletic group that includes birds, but most people don't think of birds as being dinosaurs. And this is such a great example because it is different, because dinosaur is a scientific monophyletic term. There is a monophyletic group called Dinosauria, which means that any animal that falls within that group is a dinosaur. That's how these terms work, right? But there is not any monophyletic group whose members are called fish. They're different kinds of terms, right? Okay, one more quick example from a TikTok comment again. Somebody says that whales are mammals, mammals are tetrapods, tetrapods are lobe-finned fish, and therefore whales are fish. So close, but not quite, right? Because whales are mammals, which are tetrapods, and tetrapods are sarcopterygians. The name of the monophyletic group is Sarcopterygii. What that means is that we can say that any member of this group, so like a whale, is a Sarcopterygian. That's how the terms work. We have to be careful substituting the common name for early Sarcopterygians, which is lobe-finned fish, for the entire group, which is Sarcopterygians as a whole. Whales are sarcops. That does not mean that they are fish. Okay, anyway, so back to Hank. Go ahead and give us your big finish, part 1.
But because we are what we are, we just continue to operate on 5. This is what's going to happen. It just means that I get to keep telling you that while the things you think of as fish definitely exist, there is no actual thing in the real world outside of our minds that the word fish describes. There is no such thing as a fish.
No, they definitely exist. There definitely is such a thing as fish. They're just not a monophyletic group. That's all. And there's no reason at all to think that monophyly is what decides if something really exists. Okay, big finish number 2.
Thank you. I had a good time making this.
Yeah, and I had a good time making this, so thanks to you as well.
Especially because of the point here that definitions can be 2 things. They can be our mind's version of what something is, but they can also be like the real outside of our mind version of what something is. And I think that that's fascinating.
Well, it is a cool idea. I just happen to think that it is a mistaken one. All definitions of words necessarily are our mind's version of what a thing is. Okay, so basically to sum up, here are the big conclusions from both Hank and me as I see them. Hank wants to pick a monophyletic group to associate the term fish with in order to make fish more of a real group, and he ends up settling on osteichthyes, which would make sharks not fish, but you a fish. On the other hand, I've tried to point out that any of the particular monophyletic groups that you might want to associate with fish, including osteichthyes, already all have their own names, and picking any one of them to be the sole association for fish is all equally arbitrary. So let's just let all of those names be the names for those groups and still keep fish as a non-monophyletic term that includes hagfish and lampreys and sharks and rays and all non-tetrapod osteichthyes, and a bunch of prehistoric fish that neither one of us has bothered to mention, but basically just all of the things that you mean when you say fish. As a sort of more meta conclusion, this has been a really interesting video to make because it occurred to me that both of our respective positions on this actually betray something about each of our respective academic backgrounds. So neither one of us is an evolutionary biologist, though of course it's very interesting to both of us. But Hank's background also is in the sciences themselves. He has degrees in biochemistry and in environmental science, whereas my bachelor's of science is in philosophy. Do you remember Hank actually starts his video by saying this?
So this is going to start out kind of philosophical.
And that's certainly right, but I think maybe there's a more sort of overarching meta mistake that Hank is kind of passively potentially making throughout the whole video, which is the mistake of thinking that things only started philosophical. Because as soon as you start talking about things like what language is and does, and mind versus reality, and how we ought to use our words and meanings, and how all of those things relate to scientific practice and understanding, well, now you're in my territory, baby. Welcome, everyone, to PhilSci, Philosophy of Science. Seriously, it's really cool. And the last thing I'll say is that I hope people will correct me if I'm wrong, whether that be about some of the science tidbits, or about what Hank's trying to communicate, or about my own thinking and my own arguments here. It's definitely a topic that I know a lot about, and I have thought a lot about, but that doesn't make me infallible. So just as I've tried to call out Hank on things that I think he's made errors on, if you think I've made some big mistakes, I hope you'll let me know. Again, Hank, I'm a big fan, have been for a long time, so I just hope that you and anyone else watching at least found this interesting and thought-provoking. This interesting discussion would not exist if everyone exactly agreed. So 'tis an honor to be able to virtually discuss this kind of thing with you via the internet. I hope it won't be the last time. My name is Milo, or the Majestic Mashikosaurus on YouTube, just plain old Mashikosaurus on TikTok, variations on that elsewhere. If you're into paleontology and dinosaurs, or animals in general, biology, nature and science, sometimes with a philosophical flavor, it's what I do. So thank you for watching. I hope you'll stick around.